Okay. All right. Are we good? Alrighty, guys. So welcome to the GraphQL Workshop. So this is the last workshop of today. It is also our last technical workshop. Just a quick reminder, we do have 2 more workshops tomorrow morning. Make sure to be there, earn some more points, earn those swag points, and hopefully we'll have a really good time together and learn. Yes.
How many points do we need for each one?
So anyone know any like
Are we good?
any backend languages?
Oh.
What? Any mongoose? Oh, sorry. Any backend frameworks or languages that you might use? Spring Boot. What language is that? Java, correct. So there's a lot of different backend languages that a backend language and framework that you can use. Spring Boot's one of them. What's the one for Python? Does that know? Flask, or there's also Django, which is also being popular. And then there's one for JavaScript as well, which if you're familiar with JavaScript for the front end, I highly recommend that you learn it for the back end. It's the easiest way for you to learn to create full stack applications, get all the fancy buzzwords at once. You go.
And on that note, let's go down to the basics of GraphQL. So GraphQL is basically a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those queries with your existing data. I think the easiest way to imagine a GraphQL is to basically compare it with REST APIs. Are any of you guys familiar with REST APIs? Ish, maybe? All right, well, no worries, because we'll also explain it. So for an example of REST APIs, let's give like the Vandy hacks. Let's say a client, a user for say, is Vandy hacks, and we want to basically like manage our user database. And we want to grab some information about our users just to make sure our hackers are safe and sound. So what we would do to grab like the user's name is we would have to make a GET request, or we would have to make one singular request to get the user's name. But say we also want to grab their address so that we can send them swag. Well, that would have to be another request. So that's our second request already, just to grab their address and their names. But say we also want to see if they checked in so that we can also calculate their points. That would be a third request. So in REST APIs, the system in which they would have to gather information is very individual, and they would have to have these individual requests. So the way that GraphQL is kind of different is that, say in the similar situation, there's Vandy hacks trying to get information on their users' addresses, and if they checked in or not. Well, GraphQL is really cool in the sense that it basically kind of groups everything together, and it only requires one query from like the client themselves to basically get the data that they want. And this is really easier for the user to manage from the client perspective. So here's another example of like what REST APIs might look like when you use like their code. So as I mentioned before, like there would be a first GET request, a second GET request, and a third GET request. And you can see how everything's all individualized. Now take a moment to let this sink in and look at GraphQL. Look at how condensed everything is, and the fact that there's only one query and it's very condensed. Everything is very easy to look at, and you can see that we're grabbing the user's name and the title and the followers. This is actually an example for a social media post, but you get the similar idea in which this is a lot simpler from the user's perspective. It's easier to look at. Also, it's easier to just like grab all the information at once. All right, so some other pros about GraphQL. So GraphQL is very good, and it's very easy for the front end and the back end to communicate with each other. And it's also very easy to query through like the databases. Also, it's known to be very verbose, and it's very descriptive in finding error messages, which is really useful. I'm sure as programmers, you guys have found like debugging to be like quite stressful if you don't know even what the bug is, but GraphQL is really known to like be very descriptive in saying, oh, this is what we're missing, or this is wrong. And that makes it really easy for users to actually use this language. So does everybody kind of get a gist of what GraphQL will look like, kind of like what it is? Everybody on a good point? All right, sweet. Now let's dive into a little bit into the syntax of GraphQL. So I'm going to skim through these really quick because Charlie will actually give you a live demo of these syntax examples. So this is what a field might look like. So you can see, like, let's say we have an object called a hero. Well, in GraphQL, like I said before, well, you're going to have to describe what from the hero, what kind of hero you kind of want. So in this case, we want to get like the names of the heroes. And in this example, a name is kind of like a field. On the left side is basically what you would be coding in like GraphQL. On the right side is what this query will like give back to you, the information that it will give back to you. And let's run through a couple more slides to get a few more examples. So GraphQL also has a couple of arguments. So this helps you specify what kind of data that you want to get back. It also has like aliases, which helps in which differentiate different objects. And there's also things called fragments, which to me, they're the most similar to like functions because what they basically do is if you have like repetitive parameters or like fields that you want to repeat, you can basically describe them or declare them as a fragment and then reuse them. Again, all of these will be demoed in like a code demo very shortly. So don't worry about like if this isn't syncing in very well right now. There's also these things called mutations. And actually, let's just go ahead and get started with the code demo so that we don't waste a lot more time.
Okay, let's go. So let's go to the link GraphQL.jobs. Yeah. And I will also be going to the link. So here, this is a website that is a backend and it's a database that stores all the jobs, GraphQL related jobs, and it will be updated every week. And if you scroll down, all the way down, you can see there's a way that you can actually subscribe into the newsletter, so you will receive updates every week. And all the way at the bottom, you can see there's API and there's a playground. If you go to the playground, so this is almost like a sandbox that you can just send queries to the backend and fetch data. So before we write any queries, we will first look at the schemas on the right. So the schemas are the definition of the objects that the data, how the data are stored and defined on the backend. So we see here, we have jobs, locations, country, and remote. Those are all objects defined by the organizer of the database, so that it's very clear and tells the user what kind of data should you expect. So if you click into the jobs, you can see it has type job is defined by the designer of the database, and it has all the fields like ID, title, and slug. And every field has its own type, like the ID, the type is ID, title, type is string, and you can even have objects as your field. So city is an object, and it has its own subfield, so it's almost like nested. That's why GraphQL is so useful, is because in jobs you have the cities, but in cities you also have the jobs. So for all the information you need, you just have to send one query and find a way to define all the data you want instead of sending multiple queries to fetch the data. So, okay, so we will start coding. So first, we want to write a very simple query to get some job information. So we do the bracket and jobs. And we have to tell the server what kind of data we want, what fields do we want. So in job, we see we might want a title. So we do title. And we might want the slug. We do slug. And also we might want to know the company of the job. So we do company, but you can see company is an object, so you must also provide its fields. So we do company, and what kind of fields do we want? We want the name of the company and also the slug. So that's a very basic queries. And okay, if we what to do? So we just drag it here. So if we hit run, you can see the server is giving us back all the jobs with the title, the slug, the company name, and the company slug. So just all the jobs in database available. Okay, so we comment that. And next, if we yeah, yeah, it's Control/ on Windows and Command/ on Mac. So let's say you do not want all the jobs, you want some jobs with some specifications. We can use the job query. So if you go to a schema and you look at the job, you see there's an argument, and look closely, you can see there's an exclamation mark at the end, which means you must provide some input in order to retrieve data from the database. So click into that, you see that you must provide a company slug and job slug. So let's do that. We do bracket and input. We need two inputs, so that's a bracket. We need two input. The first one is the company slug, and so the second one is job slug. So where do we get those attributes. So we will go to here. So that's the data we retrieved previously. So just find a random job. Let's say the first one. So that's the job stock. We just copy it here, put into a job stock. And that's a company stock. We also copy it here and put into the company stock. Okay. So now we have all the arguments. We can start specify what kind of fields do we want. So maybe just say we want the title of the job, right? And we might want to know what cities is the job in. So you can see city is also itself a object. So we have to specify the subfields. So we do cities. We just want the name. So the name of the city. And also we want the description of the job. So we do description. And that's the end of the query. And we hit run. And we are getting back the specific job we specified with the title, the city name, and the description. And one thing you have to remember is that if we have an exclamation mark at the end of the input, we must provide both input. So if we delete the first company stock with only the job stock left, and you run the query, there's an error because we did not provide all the input. And then you might be asking, what if I would just want a list of jobs? I don't want just one job. I want all the jobs with that job stock. We can go back to jobs. And if you go to the definition of jobs, you can see the input is not required, which means you can provide it or not. So it has a stock input. So we just change the input to be stock. And hit run. We are now getting back all the jobs with that matching stock. So just all the jobs here. And that's how we use attributes. And now I have a little challenge for you. So if I comment those out, and I'll write here so you will remember. So I want you guys to find the title and the stock of all the jobs in US. And I will give you a hint, is a stock for US. Actually, United States. That's how the stock is stored in the database. So just use a few minutes and see if you can write that query to retrieve the information you want. So if you need any help, just raise your hand. Yeah. So the name and stock of all the jobs in US. Zoom. How does it function?
Command.
Okay, is that better? Awesome. Increase the brightness. That's the best we can have. Yeah. Okay, so some of you might already have the answer, so I will just be giving the answer. So first, since we want to find all the jobs in US, so we would use I mean, there's not only one way to do it, but I will just show one. So we are doing. So we want to find the country. So we specify the country to be US. So we do the input. If we go to the schema and we look at the country, so input is the slot of the country. So, okay, we know that. So it's input. So the slot is, I just tell you that guys as a hint. So it will be United States. So now we know the country. We want to specify the attributes, the field, the field, yes, the fields we want. So we want the jobs and we want the title and slot of the jobs. So we will do.
Just a quick reminder that we're not allowed to stay at the long graph total, yeah.
So jobs and the title and the slot, which is basically it. And we run the query. I think it's stuck. Try to refresh. Okay, that's why there's an error here. So you run it and it gives you all the jobs in the US. I know there are only 6 or 7. It's weird, but like a lot of jobs don't have the country specified, but that's what we have stored in the database. Okay, now let's move on. So the next thing we want to talk about is called aliases. So let's say we want to find a city, right? We want to find a city, which is, say, New York. So we do input. And if we go to the city, we see the input is the slot of the city. So we do input, New York, and we want its name. So if we run the query, it will give us a name, right? But if we want another city, let's say copy, paste. We want to know the information about Paris. Say there will be an error because we are sending 2 queries of retrieving the city information back. Also, we know we have different arguments. The server doesn't know, so the server will get confused and say there's a conflict. So the way we solve that is that we have to assign names to each query so the server knows which one goes to which. So let's say we name the first city, city 1, and we name the second city, city 2. Now, if you run the query, there will be no error because the server knows, okay, so New York goes to city 1 and Paris goes to city 2. So that's called aliases or nickname almost like. Okay, next, now we have the names. And if we want to have different fields, we can just say it here. So city, we have the name, ID, and type. Maybe we add those. The ID, the name, and type, right? And create, add. But we have to do the same thing for both city if we want to get back same information. So now it seems pretty easy because we only have a few fields. But if we are working on a big database and we have hundreds of fields, and that would be very tedious if we would have to repeat the same process. So that introduced the idea of fragment. So what is a fragment? A fragment is, in fact, a piece of reusable code that you can insert into any query. So let's say we define our fragment here. Give a name, say comparison fields. Also, we have to specify where do we want to put the fragment, like which object. So the object is city, so we have to specify city. So within the fragment, we can copy all those fields down into here. Indentation. So now we have the fragment we can insert into the query. So the way we do is that we do 3 dots, dot, 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 and that's the name of fragment. Comparison fields. And we do the same thing for the second query. And we run. It will give us the same fields for both queries, which will save us a lot of space and time if we have like 100 of queries getting back the same fields. Okay, so until now we are you might not have noticed, but if we copy the whole block of code and paste it down below, right? So now we have 2 blocks of code. And if we run it, it will be 2 unnamed functions because we never gave them actual names. So it might not be a big issue now because we only have like few blocks of query, but if you are a company working in a company and managing a huge database, and you have hundreds of queries in your database, and one day you encounter error and you don't know which function is causing the error because it says, oh, error came from unnamed function, it'll be very bad. So you might want to give names to the query. So we can use the keyword query to actually name the query. So we do query get city. And this one we do query get city 2. So now those 2 blocks of query have different names, so we know which one is which. So we can just change the fields here for the second query. So all query blocks. So now we have 2 query blocks. So if we can run, we can choose which one to run. If we run city1, that's the result. But if we run city2, that will be the result because they now have different fields. Okay, until now, we are always talking about how to get information back from database. But there is also a way we can send information to a database. So if I comment this out and we go to the schema, we say down below we have a thing called mutation. So what is a mutation? So if a query is getting data back from database, mutation is actually sending data to a database. You either sending new data to be stored in the database, or you are updating the existing data in the database. So if you know anything about HTML, it's almost like get versus post. So you might still remember, so in the previous page, we have a place to subscribe to a newsletter. So we also have a mutation function here. So the input is that you have to give your name and email in order to subscribe. So that's right that. We do mutation, give a name, say new subscribe. And within the mutation function, we do subscribe because that's the actual name of the mutation. And we have to give input. So the first input is your name. I will just type my name, Charlie. And the second input is your email. I will just make up an email, charlie@randy.com. So that's my email. But still, okay, so okay. Yeah. But remember, even though you are sending information to the server, you still have to specify the fields you are getting back because that's just a rule. So you can choose from those fields. I would do ID, name, email. Also, I already know those 2, and the subscriber, the status, and when is my subscription created. So now I have all those fields defined. I can run the mutation and see I have been subscribed successfully. If there is an API that allows you to see all the subscriber, which is, of course, it's legal. But if there is an API, you can see my name has already been added to the database. And because we have sent new data to the database by a mutation. So that basically concludes the short demo for GraphQL. And now we will be doing GraphQL in a real application and show you guys how to incorporate that in your own app. So we'll have Kevin.
All right, so right now what we've been doing is we've been querying. And what GraphQL jobs has done for us is really nice. They've kind of built, as he mentioned before, they've kind of like built these like things where you can make queries out of. But how do we actually build these for our server? Because we actually want, so what I'm going to be teaching is actually how you can actually do these things that are actually able to fetch the data. This is what your front end does whenever you do web development. This is what your front end will make queries for. But how will my backend be able to interpret that data and actually be able to grab the data that I want? So has anyone here used Node.js before? Cool, we got a couple. All right, so What I want to do, if you want to do it locally, that's fine, but just for the sake of time, we're going to go to something called codesandbox.io. So just pull that up, and then I want you guys all to sign up for it. It's really, really cool. You can literally like do web development on the internet, which is kind of crazy. So go to codesandbox.io and create an account. You can also sign in with GitHub. So do you mind if I, oh, this is my own computer. I don't know. Lovely. So for those of you unfamiliar with servers, the basic thing you want to do with your server is you want to have the ability to take requests and create responses out of them. So a server is responsible for all the busy work with your data and actually being able to handle it and give it to a web page. So essentially what we'll be doing and what you'll be doing, we'll be creating our first server, which is huge for a lot of you because this is a very, very big step. And when we create this server, what we're essentially doing is we're creating a place where we can request information, we can receive requests, and then we can provide some sort of response for our front end or whatever like fancy thing that we have. So this is taking a lot longer than it should. So I'm just gonna, how are you guys all doing? Have you guys gotten in or no? Are we all good? Anyone still working on registering? All right, cool. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new sandbox, and we're going to create a node server. So we're going to click on that, and we're going to wait a little bit for it to actually initialize our node server. And you'll see here that we have, while it's loading, some very, very template code. So they're using something called HTTP, and then they're opening a server that is listening on port 8080. So all your computer servers, they all have ports, and these different ports are places where you can do different, where you can host servers, you can host front ends, you can do whatever you want on each of these individual ports. So I mentioned, request response, rec, res, you're taking requests. We don't really care about the request because all we want to do is just write hello world and send it to our website right here. And so we're just creating a server and we're sending that. I don't want any of this actually. So we're going to delete all of that. And what we're going to do is we're going to use this thing called dependencies, which are going to actually help us make this a lot easier to do. So there are 3 dependencies I want you guys to install. I want you to install Express, which makes creating node servers a lot easier. It's very, very popular, and it's definitely something that you'll be using with Node.js. I want you to install, sorry, I spelled Express wrong. It should be 2 S's. Also, you should also be very careful because sometimes you spell stuff wrong. Some people will actually make like really bad dependencies that will like hack your stuff. So make sure that always, whenever it comes to any sort of code, that you're always spelling stuff correctly. So Express. We want Express hyphen GraphQL. This is a way for us to use GraphQL on Express. But we actually need to install GraphQL itself. So the last thing that we want to put in our dependencies is GraphQL. So we install GraphQL. Does this look good? Yeah, all those versions are pretty good. So how are we doing? Have we installed all 3? Cool. So now we need to import them. So in JavaScript, what we do, I forgot what version of JavaScript you do this in, but basically what we do is we have to require, at least this syntax is supported on most websites. So we're saying is var express equals require express. We're saying, hey, this package.json right here is a way for us to actually use our resources. So we're saying, hey, package, like we need to use express. And then what we're going to do is we're also going to have to require express GraphQL, but we're actually going to use a specific part of that because we don't want to import everything because that would take a lot of time. So we'd say GraphQL, I bet my tongue. HTTP in braces, and we'll say require express GraphQL. Also, as I mentioned before, it's imperative that you spell these all correctly. And then we'll also call something called build schema, which will actually help us build those schemas that we saw earlier. And we'll say, and we'll take it from GraphQL. So import these three things. Also, they are all on the GitHub. So if you go to github.com/bandhacks, our completed code will be there. So if you're ever falling behind, if you ever have a typo or something, just go check it out. So we have our three dependencies. And now I'm just going to create a very, very basic Express server. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to create something called app, and I am going to basically initialize Express. Just like that. Very, very simple. As I mentioned before, Express is great to use very quickly for stuff like hackathons where you want to build an app very, very quickly and get it up and going. So now we are going to say app.listen. So we are going to, as mentioned before, we are going to listen on the port. I'm going to put the port in a variable just for some fancy fun practices. 8080. Well, that's frequently what you'll use for servers. 3000 is what you generally want to use for front ends. So we'll say port 8080, and then we'll say we'll listen on port 8080. You can even put 8000 here, but we're just going to say port. All right, and then we're going to have a callback function. So once this app is able to listen on port 8080, we're going to say, we don't even need that. We'll say console.log, which will log it in our terminal. This is like the system.out.println or the print of JavaScript. And we'll say listening, like you can put whatever you want here, but this is just for us to let us know that we are actually doing it right. So we will say listening to port, and we'll put the port in. I don't need that space there. So if I save this, the really cool thing about Code Sandbox is that it uses NodeMon immediately, which will actually update things as soon as you save it. So you'll see we have a problem. We cannot get this place because we haven't built anything that will actually support it. So we're actually not going to worry about that for now. Instead, we're going to actually create our first endpoint. An endpoint is where you're going to actually listen or where you're actually going to make requests to the server. So we're just going to call it GraphQL because we're going to use GraphQL. We'll write a comma. And it's also very important that you put this before the listen. Ordering is very, very important in Express, as I learned a very, very hard way a long time ago. But GraphQL. And then we're going to use that GraphQL HTTP thing we said earlier. And we are going to build a schema. So there are a couple of things that we have to do. We have to build our schema as before, and we also need to give it a root value or something that we can use to actually call certain functions. So schema time. So we are going to create a very simple schema. So var schema equals build schema, which is what we called in GraphQL. And we are going to create a schema, and the schema is basically a way for us to basically say, this is how our data must be structured. So I am very short on time. So let's say we're going to make a schema of type query. And by the way, this little thing right here is the quote that you have on the top left of your computer. I forgot the exact word for it. There you go. And that's basically a way for you to make a multi-line string. So let's say type query. And then we are going to say, we're going to say something like agency. No, we're not. We're just going to say something like root. And we're going to say, you know what? We are very short on time. I'm gonna talk real quickly about building our first things. So what we're going to do is we're going to use something called, we're going to create a database of agencies, of space agencies, because we're space themed. So go on github.com/bandyhacks and go to the repository with GraphQL, and you'll see that I put an array there. So what I want you to do is create an array, I'll call it space agencies, and then I want you to copy and paste. I want you to go right here, GraphQL Workshop, click on that. And I have this little array here. I want you to take it all. They have this fancy copy thing, so I'll copy it right now. And I want you to go in and I want you to paste it. So now we have our lovely little space agencies. This is our data. You can use something like Mongo, you can use something like SQL, but for now we're just going to create an array. It's a lot easier and it's a lot easier to do for now. So let's say that we want to create something called an agency. We want to establish something called an agency. And this agency, it's got a couple of things. It's got a name, and that name is a type string. I spelled that wrong. String. We have a nation, that's a type string. We have a region, type string. We have year founded, which is an int. And then landed on moon, which is a Boolean. And this aligns exactly with our objects that we have here. So we have all these different objects, and each of them have a name, nation, region, year founded, landed on moon, etc. And then queries, where we're actually going to support making these queries. So I'm going to create a new query called agency, and it's going to have name, and it's going to take in one parameter. That's a name of type string. And I put an exclamation point there because it basically says that this is a required parameter. This is something that must be passed in, otherwise it'll throw an error. I'm going to put a colon here, and I'm going to say the thing that I want to return is something of type agency. How are we doing? All right, so how do we connect this query thing with our actual data right here? So what we're going to do real quick is we're actually going to create a function real quick. So we're going to say var get agency equals function. And GraphQL always passes thing an object. So we're going to just call it args. And this args is going to be a singular object with all our arguments. And then we're going to return space agencies, which is our array space agencies. And we're going to use something called filter, which will filter our array. And then this is basically a very, very fancy for loop. JavaScript is very, very cool to use because it creates a lot of very, very quick ways to do things. So we're going to filter it, and we're going to create a function out. So each of these individual times we access an individual element of this array, we're going to do something with that individual element. So we're going to actually return anytime the agency's name, which is agency.name, really cool, JavaScript is great, equals args.name. So within our arguments, what value, what object actually has the value name. And this actually returns an array, and we only want the first element because we're just returning one agency. So you just put a 0 in brackets, and that will get the first element of that array. So now we need to make something called a root, and this is like, hey, what can my server support? So we'll say var root. All right, and we'll say agency. So whenever we make a query for something called agency, we're gonna actually call get agency. Make sure that you don't put. The really cool thing about JavaScript, as I mentioned before, there are a ton of things. Is you can literally call functions like this. It's great. So functions are objects. So now it brings a whole new meaning to this. Why did we put this here earlier? Because we're basically supporting an agency, which is this root right here. And we're able to create a query out of it. So real quick, a couple more lines of code that we got to do. So we got our GraphQL HTTP. We're going to tell GraphQL that we have a schema, and that schema is this, the schema that we put here earlier. We have a root value, and it's going to be root, which you put right here. And then GraphQL has this cool thing called graphical, which will actually let us visualize the requests that we make. So we'll say graphical, and we'll set it to true. I hope this works. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to save it. listening on port 88. It seems to be working. So I'm going to open this in new tab. And now I mentioned before that we made the endpoint /GraphQL. So we actually have to go to /GraphQL. Please load. Thank you. All right, cool. So now we actually have GraphQL. And now we're just going to make our very basic query that we just made. So let's say query get by name. All right, and then we'll bring it a function. So or we'll give it a variable like name, and you have to denote that with a $sign. And then we say this is type string and it's required. All right. And what do we want to return? We want to call agency, and we pass in that parameter. All right, and then here we can return whatever we want. So I can just say like I want to only see the name and region. So this is basically what our front end is going to be requesting. And actually, we actually now add this new thing called query variables. So we need to add a certain variable. So let's say the name that we're actually passing in, this is what you would call in your front end function. You'd say like name equals NASA. Let's see what happens. And voila, I'm very, very surprised that that actually worked properly. But let's say I call a nation. Still works. Yeah, GraphQL is great. Use it. Nation, I don't know. Errors, as you can see, it provides us this really, really detailed error. And this one time when I was doing it, I put down nation instead of region. I was like, did you mean nation? Like, it's owned by GraphQL was made and owned by Facebook. They're very, very smart with their AI, unfortunately. And basically, they translate those skills into GraphQL, and that saves so much time whenever you're debugging your front and back end. It's very, very verbose with its errors, which is really, really, really good. So that was our very quick end because we are very, very short on time.
Yes, we are. Alrighty, guys, so that is going to bring the end of this workshop. Does anybody have any quick questions that we might be able to answer? Alrighty, so here's a check-in link for this workshop. Make sure you get your points because you guys definitely deserve it. And yeah, I just want to thank you guys so much. This was the last workshop of like tonight, and it's almost midnight. So really, really, really appreciate you guys coming, and hope you guys enjoy the rest of VH8. Let us know if you guys have any questions on the Discord. Again, my name is Seok. That's Kevin and Charlie. And yeah, just hit us up on Discord if you need us to. But other than that, please, please, please have a great night. Get some rest. Bright and early tomorrow, we have breakfast at 8 o'clock, and we also have coffee. We have lots of great food and lots of events tomorrow with sponsors and our HE events. So please come by whenever you can. But other than that, have a great night. Thank you guys for coming again. Yes, please come grab your swag. We have a lot of great swag items this year. So